June 4th, 1943. Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. The pencil shook slightly as Unteroffizier Werner Burkhardt wrote in his hidden diary, recording words that, if found by his officers, could have sent him to solitary confinement. The Americans must be lying to us. No nation could have such abundance while fighting on two fronts. Through the train window, Burkhardt had just seen something that challenged 3 years of Nazi propaganda. Electric lights illuminated every farmhouse, every street, every store, a sea of brightness stretching endlessly across the Texas plains at 10 o'clock at night. In Germany, blackout regulations had kept cities in darkness since 1940. Even before the war, less than a quarter of German farms had electricity. Yet here, in the very land Nazi propaganda described as decadent and collapsing, power seemed as limitless as the night sky. 1,850 veterans of Erwin Rommel's Africa course stepped off the train. They did not arrive in freight wagons or cattle cars, but in Pullman coaches with cushioned seats, dining service and sleeping compartments. The entire town of Mexia had come to see them. None of them could have imagined that this day would begin one of the most extraordinary transformations in modern prisoner of war history, the slow dismantling of Nazi belief through the undeniable reality of American industry. The proof of Allied victory was not only in the battlefields but in production numbers, numbers that would soon shatter every certainty these men once held about their homeland and their cause. The collapse had begun weeks earlier, on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim, who had replaced Rommel, surrendered along with about 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian troops. The numbers differed slightly, as smaller groups continued to give up over the following days. These men were no ordinary soldiers. They were the battle-hardened veterans who had driven the British back to Egypt, earning the reluctant respect of General Montgomery himself. Among them was Captain Friedrich Radke, decorated with the Iron Cross First Class, a veteran of the France campaign, and twice wounded in North Africa. His diary, discovered decades later in the U.S. National Archives, would become one of the most valuable records for historians seeking to understand how captivity in America changed the mindset of German soldiers. Their journey from defeat to awakening began at the port of Oran, Algeria. As Radke and 30,000 other prisoners waited in temporary camps for transport ships, American organization began to erode their old assumptions. The U.S. Army managed thousands of captives daily with a precision that surpassed even the Wehrmacht at its height. Every prisoner was photographed, documented, examined by medical staff, vaccinated, and informed of his rights under the Geneva Convention, all explained fluently in German by American officers trained for this specific duty. The first true moment of astonishment came with the food. Corporal Hans Muller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother 8 months later, "In the camp at Oran while we waited for the ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in half a year of desert warfare. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was meant to impress us, a form of propaganda. We did not understand that this was their normal army ration. The ships that would carry them across the Atlantic were themselves symbols of America's unmatched industrial strength. One such ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, had been built in only 4 days and 15 hours at the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California. Had the Germans heard of it, they would have dismissed the claim as pure propaganda. These Liberty ships were being produced at a rate of about 3 per day during the height of the war effort. After delivering supplies to the Allied forces in Europe, they returned with human cargo up to 30,000 prisoners of war each month by the summer of 1943. The 2-week journey across the Atlantic in July 1943 marked the next stage in what historians later described as the quiet dismantling of Nazi belief. Sergeant Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept a detailed record, preserved in letters he sent home after his return to Germany. He wrote that the American sailors threw away more food in one day than his entire company had been given in a week during the last months in Africa. They tossed out half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk that had sat too long, Zimmermann noted. They did this without arrogance, not to mock us, but simply because to them this waste meant nothing. Their supplies were endless. The ships themselves became moving lessons in American productivity. The prisoners soon learned that the vessel carrying them was only one among 2,710 Liberty ships constructed during the war. Each required around 250,000 individual parts, all produced across 32 U.S. states. The engines, the guards explained, were assembled from 900 horsepower cylinders built in 3 separate factories and then joined together at new port facilities that had not even existed 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Steuben, a member of an old Prussian military family whose ancestors had served since the time of Frederick the Great, later reflected on the moment in his memoirs. As our ship neared the American shore, I watched a radar antenna rotating above the bridge. We had believed that only Germany and perhaps Britain possessed such devices in small numbers. Yet here it was, standard equipment on a cargo ship. That was when I first understood that Germany had already lost the war. On August 2, 1943, at Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia, the German prisoners finally saw the heart of the American war machine. The base stretched across more than 4,000 acres, its docks running for miles, lined with cranes loading and unloading dozens of ships at once. In a single day, the port moved more cargo than Hamburg could handle in a week. Private Johann Weber, who had worked in a Ruhr factory before his conscription, wrote in his hidden journal that he counted 47 cargo ships being loaded or unloaded. Each crane, he recorded, lifted weights that would have required a dozen men and horses in Germany. They ran on electric power, smooth and quiet, without the coal smoke that darkened our industrial cities. The prisoners were lined up in orderly columns for the march toward the waiting trains. Along the way, they passed parking lots filled with cars owned by civilian workers. There were hundreds of them, each belonging to dock laborers and technicians. In Germany, the private car was still a symbol of privilege, reserved mostly for the wealthy or the politically connected. The Volkswagen, promised to ordinary citizens since 1934, had remained largely a dream, with fewer than 1,000 ever reaching civilian hands. Yet here in America, everyday workers drove to their jobs in their own automobiles as if it were the most natural thing in the world, but nothing could have prepared them for the trains themselves. They were not loaded into boxcars or the 40 and 8 wagons that had carried German troops across Europe. Instead, they boarded full passenger coaches. The Pullman cars had cushioned seats that converted into sleeping berths. The dining cars offered white tablecloths and real silver utensils. Some cars even had large windows designed for viewing the landscape. Captain Rodkey later wrote, "We boarded like travelers, not captives." The American guards seemed uneasy about the comfort. One sergeant even apologized because the air conditioning in our car wasn't working properly. Air conditioning, in August. We had believed such luxury existed only on the Führer's private train. The 3-day train journey from Norfolk to the prisoner camps in Texas and Oklahoma would dismantle Nazi ideology more effectively than any defeat on the battlefield. As the trains rolled through Virginia, the prisoners pressed their faces to the glass, staring at an America that should not have existed according to their training and propaganda. Every small town glowed with electric light. Places like Martinsville, Danville, and Greensboro towns, that in Germany might have had a single dim streetlight shone with illuminated shop windows, electric signs, and homes bright in every room. The trains passed factories running through the night, their windows glowing, their parking lots full even at midnight. Corporal Mueller, whose father had been a Nazi Party block leader in Hamburg, described what he saw in a letter discovered decades later. "That first night, we passed through dozens of towns. Every one had more light than all of Hamburg combined. The guards told us that every American town had electricity since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He only smiled and said I would find out for myself." When the train stopped in Roanoke, Virginia, to take on water and coal, the prisoners watched with disbelief. American railway workers completed in half an hour what would have taken 2 hours in Germany. Machines did the work of many automatic coal loaders, electric water pumps, and mechanical systems that kept the engines running without pause. More astonishing still was the ease and comfort of the workers themselves. They wore sturdy leather boots that would have cost a German worker 2 months' pay. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles, tossing them away when empty. They smoked without rationing, often letting half-burned cigarettes fall to the ground. Sergeant Heinrich Müller, an electrical engineer from Siemens before the war, later wrote in his journal that the rail yard they stopped in used more electricity in 1 hour than his entire neighborhood in Berlin consumed in a day. "The waste was magnificent," he wrote. "Lights burned in empty buildings. Fans spun in rooms with no one inside. It was as if they possessed an endless source of power." As the trains moved west through Tennessee and Kentucky, the scale of American industry revealed itself in full. From their windows, the prisoners saw enormous factories stretching across the landscape. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee extended for 3 miles along the river, its electric furnaces consuming 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, the train slowed beside the Rubbertown complex, where vast synthetic rubber plants had risen in less than 2 years. 4 major facilities, each employing thousands of workers, now produced 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. Germany, though the birthplace of the process, had never achieved more than 120,000 tons in its best year. The arrival at the camps marked the next stage in the prisoners' transformation. Camp Hearn, Texas had been built in only 4 months, and housed between 3,000 and 5,000 men in conditions far better than most had experienced, even as civilians. The wooden barracks had electric lighting, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heating. Each building used more lumber than entire German villages could have afforded. The camp's hospital amazed the German medical officers. Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself working in a facility that was better equipped than most hospitals in Germany. It had X-ray machines, surgical instruments, and medical supplies that had not been available at home since 1941, all provided as standard equipment for prisoners of war. They had penicillin, Dr. Bauer later recalled. We had only heard rumors of such a medicine. They used it freely, even for minor infections among the prisoners. German soldiers were dying for lack of simple sulfa drugs, and yet the Americans gave us their most advanced medicine without hesitation. The camp kitchen became another lesson in American abundance. Prisoners assigned to cooking duties discovered walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automatic dishwashers, and gas ranges capable of feeding 5,000 men. Their daily meals included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread in quantities unseen in Germany since 1939. Sergeant Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, wrote, "Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, simply extra. American rules required us to prepare 10% more than needed so that every prisoner received a full meal. The rest was discarded. I cried as I threw away perfectly good bread." By September 1943, the growing labor shortage in American agriculture led to the use of German prisoners in farms and factories across the country. What began as a practical decision would soon become one of the most effective tools in breaking Nazi ideology. Groups of prisoners were transported each day to work sites without blindfolds or restricted routes. They saw everything: the vast stretches of farmland, the factories running at all hours, the stores full of products, the parking lots crowded with cars, and the homes equipped with radios and refrigerators. At a cotton gin outside Houston, Sergeant Herbert Lang watched a single machine process more cotton in 1 hour than his entire village could have handled in a month, using manual labor. The machine was powered by electricity supplied through the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural electrification effort that had brought power to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. The farmer who owned the gin was no one special, Lang wrote. He was not an aristocrat, not a party member, just an ordinary farmer. Yet he had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. His workers, including the African Americans, ate lunches containing more food than German workers received in a week, and this was not unusual. Every farm we passed was the same. In Nebraska, the prisoners were assigned to work in the vast sugar beet fields, where they witnessed levels of agricultural mechanization beyond anything they could have imagined. A single combine harvester, they discovered, could perform the work of 100 men. The fields stretched endlessly across the horizon, each one larger than entire German counties. The farmers spoke casually of yields that sounded impossible by European standards: 60 bushels of wheat per acre compared to Germany's 30 on the most fertile land. Private Wilhelm Hoffman, who worked on a farm near Scottsbluff, later wrote, "The farmer's son, only 16 years old, drove a tractor worth more than my father had earned in his entire life. When I told him that, the boy laughed and said it wasn't even a very good tractor. His father was waiting for a new model from John Deere that would be better." The most striking realizations, however, came to those prisoners who worked near or within American factories. Although the Geneva Convention forbade them from working directly on war materials, they were allowed to assist in industries that supported the war effort indirectly. This rule gave thousands of German soldiers the chance to see American industrial power up close. At a Campbell's soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners watched automated production lines that processed more tomatoes in a single day than most German facilities could manage in a month. The factory operated with a limited workforce of older men and women, as the younger workers were serving in the military, yet production surpassed pre-war output. Sergeant Major Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a German food processing plant before the war, described the experience in his notes. "Everything was mechanized," he wrote. "Electric conveyor belts moved constantly. Automatic machines filled cans and sealed them, while huge steam cookers processed hundreds at once. One elderly woman sat at a control panel, managing what would have required 50 workers in Germany. She did this while drinking coffee and listening to the radio." Near Detroit, other prisoners were assigned to unload coal at a power plant, where they caught glimpses of the American automotive industry's transformation for wartime needs. Across the river stood the River Rouge complex, one of the largest industrial sites in the world. It employed 100,000 workers producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The facility consumed more than 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity every day, more than the entire city of Hamburg. Private Franz Kellner wrote in his diary, "We could see the parking lots filled with thousands of cars belonging to the workers. In Germany, even officers rarely owned a car. Here the guards told us that many workers had two, one for work and another for the family. We thought he was joking." By the winter of 1943, the combined effect of these experiences was beginning to erode the ideological foundation of the captured soldiers. American intelligence officers described the phenomenon as ideological collapse syndrome. The Special Projects Division, a secret re-education program organized by the Office of the Provost Marshal General, documented a growing number of requests from prisoners for access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials. Major Paul Noland, one of the officers overseeing the program, reported in December 1943, "The prisoners no longer argue when we present them with production figures. They have seen too much. The most devoted Nazis have become quiet. They still speak of loyalty to Germany, but they no longer speak of victory. Many now admit that what they were told about America was false. The newspapers produced inside the prison camps began to reflect a growing change in thought. One of the most significant was Der Ruf, The Call, printed by prisoners at Fort Kearny in Rhode Island. What began as a voice of defiance and nationalism slowly evolved into a publication exploring democracy, economics, and the rebuilding of Europe after the war. The editors, who were carefully chosen anti-Nazi prisoners, found their readers increasingly open to new ideas. Lieutenant Hermann Gutz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter that passed through American censors, "We were told that America was a weak, divided nation, ruled by foreign interests, incapable of strength or unity. Every day I am here, I see the opposite. This is the most organized, disciplined, and powerful country on earth. We were told fairy tales by criminals." The most unexpected and damaging blow to Nazi ideology came after Italy's surrender in September. Italian prisoners who chose to cooperate with the Allies were organized into Italian service units and granted better housing, higher pay, and greater freedom. The German prisoners watched in disbelief as their former allies worked alongside Americans, ate in American restaurants, and even socialized with local women. Captain Friedrich Schultz wrote, "The Italians betrayed us, yet they are treated better than we ever treated them when they were our allies. They work freely, earn wages, and send packages home. The Americans show them respect instead of hatred. The democracy we were taught to despise seems far more honorable than our own system." Then came Christmas of 1943, an event that deeply moved even the most hardened prisoners. Across the country, American civic organizations, churches, and charities sent over 500,000 Christmas packages to German POWsmen who, only months earlier, had been fighting their sons, husbands, and brothers. Each package contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and small games. In many towns, local families invited prisoners to join them for Christmas dinner, though few could accept due to military regulations. At Camp Hearn in Texas, the local Methodist choir performed Christmas carols in German, while women from the town sent homemade cakes and cookies. Boy Scouts delivered handmade cards to the prisoners, many decorated with simple messages of peace and goodwill. This unexpected kindness struck directly at the foundation of Nazi racial beliefs. Lieutenant Walter Müller, whose brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote, "They know we are their enemies. Many have lost loved ones because of our bombs and our armies, yet they treat us with compassion and decency. This is not propaganda, it is genuine. What kind of people show such mercy to their enemies? Only those completely confident in their victory and in the strength of their nation." The Christmas dinner itself left a lasting impression. Tables were filled with turkey, ham, potatoes with gravy, vegetables, pies, and ice cream, an abundance of food few Germans had seen since before the First World War. The prisoners ate until they could eat no more, overwhelmed by the generosity of their captors. Sergeant Hansa later wrote, "We ate like kings, better than German generals, better than party leaders. And they told us this was an ordinary American Christmas meal, that every family in America was eating the same. If they can feed their prisoners like this, what must their soldiers at the front be eating?" By early 1944, more than 40,000 German prisoners were taking part in educational programs across the United States. They studied English, American history, mathematics, and the sciences. The University of Chicago offered correspondence courses, while professors from Stanford University traveled to camps to lecture on democracy and economics. The hunger for learning seemed limitless. Men who had once believed Americans were uncultured discovered vast libraries filled with millions of books, universities open to all social classes, and a culture that placed knowledge above privilege. They read freely from American newspapers, comparing opposing opinions, something unimaginable in Germany, under censorship and propaganda. Captain Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist who had been conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. Later he wrote, "American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without anger or resentment. They spoke of science as belonging to all humanity. Their research was far ahead of ours, and they shared it openly, even with prisoners of war." To minds shaped by Nazi ideology, this generosity was beyond comprehension. The camp theaters also became unexpected classrooms. Instead of propaganda, the prisoners were shown American films. They watched Gone with the Wind and saw a story of defeat, resilience, and national renewal that reflected their own uncertain future. They watched The Grapes of Wrath and were stunned that a nation at war would allow its flaws and social struggles to be displayed so openly. Lieutenant Joseph Kramer wrote, "They hide nothing. They show their problems, their failures, their divisions, Yet this honesty makes them stronger, not weaker. In Germany, such openness would have meant death. Here it is considered an act of patriotism. By the spring of 1944, as American industry reached its peak, the prisoner labor program expanded further. German POWs were assigned to canneries, mills, and factories, where they saw firsthand the industrial power that had made their capture inevitable. The numbers were impossible to deny. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, prisoners unloaded steel destined to become landing craft for the invasion of Europe. They watched as the factory produced 700 boats each month, each requiring 20,000 individual parts. The plant employed 20,000 workers, including thousands of women who operated cranes, welded hulls, and managed production lines with precision and discipline. Sergeant Major Kurt Zimmerman later reflected, "Women doing men's work, African Americans operating complex machinery, teenagers running drills, everything we were told could not happen in a democracy was happening before our eyes. And yet production never stopped. 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They built more boats in 1 month than our Navy built in a year." At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed an even greater display of industrial scale. The plant produced 10,000 tons of steel each day. The blast furnaces roared continuously, supplied by endless trains carrying iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. The magnitude was staggering. Private Paul Hartman, who had worked at the Krupp Works before the war, wrote, "This one plant produced more steel than the entire Ruhr district at its peak. I thought I understood manufacturing, but this was beyond anything we could imagine. They wasted more steel in spillage than we could produce. Their workers complained about long hours while achieving outputs we could never reach, even with forced labor and double shifts." By the summer of 1944, the final remnants of Nazi propaganda about American weakness had completely collapsed. Across the Midwest, German prisoners worked in the harvest and saw the vast power of American agriculture. In Kansas, they watched endless wheat fields stretching beyond sight, each farm producing more grain than entire German provinces. Giant combines moved across the land like ships sailing an ocean of gold, each harvesting 100 acres per day. The towering grain elevators they filled could hold more wheat than Germany imported in an entire year. Sergeant Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, wrote, "One American farmer with his machines does the work of 100 German farmers. They showed me aerial photographs of the wheat fields, thousands of square miles of grain. They could lose half their harvest and still have more than all of Europe combined." In California's Central Valley, prisoners worked in orchards that seemed endless, stretching as far as they could see. They watched in disbelief as perfectly good fruit was discarded simply for minor blemishes, fruit that would have been treasured in Germany. At times, entire crops were plowed under to maintain prices, a practice that many prisoners could not comprehend. "They destroyed food to keep prices stable," wrote Private Otto Schultz. "Mountains of oranges were bulldozed into pits because there were too many. We begged to send them to Germany, to our families. The guards were kind but said it was impossible. The waste itself was proof of their power, of their unlimited resources." On June 6, 1944, when news of the Allied invasion of Normandy reached the camps, the remaining illusions of Nazi propaganda finally collapsed. The scale of the operation, 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 men landing in a single day, was beyond anything the prisoners had imagined possible. At Camp Shelby, newsreels of the invasion were shown within days. The prisoners watched endless lines of ships, floating harbors, and a supply chain that delivered 15,000 tons of material each day directly onto open beaches. They saw their homeland being overrun by the very nation they had been told was too weak to fight. Colonel Friedrich von Tauben later wrote, "We knew then that everything was lost, not only the war but the entire Nazi dream. We had challenged the greatest industrial power in the world with superstition and arrogance. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatic weapons, and courage against their limitless resources. Throughout their captivity, German prisoners encountered something even more powerful than American industry, American humanity. Propaganda had painted Americans as weak, sentimental, and self-indulgent. Instead, the prisoners found a people confident enough in their strength to show compassion. When Private Hans Miller received news that his son had died in the bombing of Hamburg, the camp commander personally brought the Red Cross message and offered his condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher's wife wrote that she could no longer feed their children, American church groups sent food packages to her in Germany to enemy civilians. Even as the war continued, they separated the German people from the Nazi regime, wrote Captain Otto. "They said they were fighting Hitler, not the German people. We thought it was propaganda, but it was true. They were already preparing us to rebuild Germany, not to destroy it." The medical care in the camps left a particularly deep impression. German doctors were allowed to work alongside American medical staff, learning new methods, and using equipment far more advanced than what was available in wartime Germany. Prisoners received surgeries and treatments that even German officers could not have afforded at home. Perhaps most striking was the attention given to mental health, something virtually unknown in the Wehrmacht. Dr. Friedrich Bauer wrote, "They treated suicide attempts with understanding, not punishment. Prisoners who suffered mental breakdowns were given therapy, not beatings." This compassion toward their enemies revealed a kind of strength we had never understood, the quiet confidence of true power. By March 1945, the secret American re-education program for German prisoners had achieved extraordinary results. More than 25,000 prisoners had voluntarily enrolled in courses about democracy, economics, and political philosophy. Camp newspapers now published articles discussing constitutional government, free enterprise, and civil rights. Within classrooms and barracks, lively debates took place about the future of Germany after the war. The program had gone far beyond what anyone had expected. Men who had once arrived as devoted Nazis were now writing essays on democratic reform. Officers who had once sworn allegiance to Hitler were drawing plans to apply American agricultural techniques in post-war Germany. Colonel Hermann Göring, unrelated to the Reichsmarschall of the same name, would later recall in a 1975 interview, "We became missionaries for democracy, not because of propaganda or pressure, but through what we saw. We saw democracy functioning. We saw ordinary Americans living better than the German elite. We wanted that for Germany." The transformation was so thorough that it even began to concern some American officials. A number of prisoners became so attached to American life that they asked permission to remain in the United States after the war. Some formed long-distance friendships through camp correspondence programs, and a few even married American women. In the years that followed, thousands of these former prisoners would eventually immigrate to the United States during the 1950s, seeking to live in the country that had changed their worldview. In April 1945 came the final and most painful revelation. As Allied forces liberated the concentration camps in Europe, the film footage was shown to German prisoners across America. Many refused to believe it at first, convinced it was another form of propaganda. But the evidence was undeniable. Eyewitness accounts from American soldiers, official photographs, and eventually letters from home confirming the atrocities. The realization broke what little remained of their faith in the regime they had once served. Men who had managed to preserve a sense of German pride despite military defeat were now forced to face moral collapse. Everything they had believed in was not only destroyed, it was corrupt. Captain Walter Schmidt expressed this awakening with haunting clarity. "We thought we were fighting for a great and noble cause. We discovered that we were serving criminals. We believed we were bringing civilization to others. But we learned that we were the barbarians. The Americans, whom we called weak and decadent, showed us what true civilization meant." When the war ended in May 1945, the prisoners awaited repatriation with a mixture of relief, shame, and uncertainty. They had witnessed an America that contradicted everything they had been told. They had eaten better as captives than as soldiers. They had been treated with more humanity by their enemies than by their own leaders. In the final months before their return, American authorities focused on preparing them for life in a devastated homeland. Vocational training, agricultural education, and political instruction became part of their daily routine. The prisoners even learned about a proposed economic recovery plan that would later be known as the Marshall Plan, before it was made public. They understood that America intended to rebuild, not destroy Germany. Colonel Friedrich von Tauben wrote, "They prepared us to rebuild our nation. They gave us knowledge, skills, and hope. They turned defeated men into future citizens." Such generosity from a victorious enemy was something no German could have imagined under Hitler's world of vengeance. Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German prisoners were returned from American camps to a homeland left in ruins, divided, impoverished, and uncertain of its future. Yet these men carried with them something invaluable, first-hand knowledge of how a free, prosperous, and democratic society could function. They had seen industrial efficiency unmatched by any in Europe. They had witnessed agricultural abundance and social fairness. And most importantly, they had lived within a system where dignity, education, and opportunity were not reserved for the few, but offered to all. These experiences made them quiet but powerful contributors to Germany's post-war rebirth. They had seen that reconstruction was possible because they had lived among a people who had already achieved it. Many former prisoners of war went on to play important roles in rebuilding West Germany after 1945. Hans Kroll, once held at Camp Shelby, later became West Germany's ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who had taught classes for fellow prisoners at Camp Como, became the first president of the European Commission. Rüdiger von Weschmar, who spent his captivity at Camp Herne, would serve as Germany's permanent representative to the United Nations. Edward Ackermann, once a prisoner at Fort Robinson, became a leader in modernizing German agriculture. They carried home what they had learned in America: efficiency in production, innovation in farming, and the principles of democratic governance. The economic miracle that lifted West Germany in the 1950s was built, in part, on the knowledge and values acquired inside American prison camps. We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest, Hans Kroll wrote in his memoirs. We saw that democracy created wealth, that diversity strengthened a nation, and that treating workers with fairness increased productivity. These lessons learned as prisoners shaped the new Germany. Historians have described the German POW experience in the United States as one of the most successful re-education efforts in history. It worked without coercion, without indoctrination, and without the tools of traditional propaganda. Instead, it relied on reality. The prisoners saw an American society that functioned efficiently and humanely, even while at war. They saw factories that never stopped, farms that produced in abundance, and communities that treated enemies with respect. They experienced a level of comfort and stability that made Nazi promises look like hollow illusions. Dr. Arnold Kramer, a leading historian of German POWs in America, summarized it best: America won the propaganda war not through clever messages, but through the power of everyday life. Every full meal, every electric light, every working toilet was an argument against Nazism. The prisoners were convinced not by words, but by prosperity. The records confirm this success. Of the 371,683 German POWs held in the United States, fewer than 1% attempted to escape, with only 2,222 escape attempts in total. Post-war surveys found that 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Even decades later, thousands of former prisoners continued writing to the American families they had met during their captivity, maintaining friendships that lasted for generations. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the end of the war, more than 500 former German POWs returned to the United States for a reunion in Austin, Texas. Many brought their children and grandchildren to see the country where their transformation had begun. Former Corporal Hans Weah, who had been held at Fort Robinson in Nebraska and later became a physician in Georgetown, Maine, spoke to the gathering. "Life in the camps was an improvement for many of us," he said. "We came from small apartments with no heat, no running water, and constant shortages. In America we discovered warmth, food, and above all dignity." Former Sergeant Major Kurt Meir, who had worked on farms in Iowa, added, "The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared their meals, their tools, and their kindness. Their humanity, shown to men whose armies were fighting their sons, changed us forever." At the reunion dinner in 1985, former Colonel Hermann Goetz, then 78 years old, stood before the audience to deliver a speech that perfectly captured the meaning of their shared journey. "We came to America as enemies, as believers in falsehoods, and as men loyal to a regime built on lies. We left as friends, as Democrats, and as men who had seen the truth. America taught us that real strength does not come from conquest but from creation, not from hatred, but from unity, not from tyranny, but from freedom." We witnessed the arsenal of democracy at work. We saw farmers who fed nations, workers who built the tools of victory, and citizens who treated even their enemies with respect. We learned that America's greatest weapon was not its machines or its armies, but its endless capacity to create and its confidence in the future. We returned to Germany with a mission: to build, not to destroy, to achieve prosperity through peace, not through war. The Germany that rose from the ashes was born from the lessons we learned in American prison camps. We came as conquerors and left as students. To America, from your former enemies, now your friends, we say thank you for showing us the way. When Goetz finished speaking, the entire auditorium rose to its feet. The applause echoed through the hall as Americans and Germans, once divided by war, stood together, united by gratitude and remembrance. What had begun with suspicion and hostility in the summer of 1943 had ended in understanding and friendship, a quiet victory of humanity over ideology. The German POW experience in America: statistics, camp infrastructure, over 500 camps across 45 states, every state except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont, 175 main camps with 325 branch camps, camps built to house from 250 to 12,000 prisoners each. Prisoner population: 171,683 German POWs, part of 425,871 total Axis POWs. Peak population in May 1945. Average of 20,000 new arrivals monthly in 1943, 30,000 monthly after D-Day, 60,000 monthly in the final months of the war. Labor contribution: 114 million man-days of agricultural labor, 100 million board feet of lumber processed, $230 million in labor value in 1940s dollars, 80 cents daily wage per prisoner. Prisoners filled critical labor shortages in 46 states. Escape statistics. Only 2,222 escape attempts from over 371,000 prisoners. Few successful permanent escapes. Most escapees recaptured within 24 hours. No American civilians were harmed by escaped POWs. Educational programs. Over 40,000 enrolled in educational courses, 135 camp newspapers published, 30,000 taking English classes, 15,000 in vocational training, university correspondence courses for 8,000. Post-war immigration. Approximately 5,000 former POWs immigrated to the U.S. after the war. Over 12,000 maintained correspondence with American families. Average correspondence duration was 31 years. Many returned as tourists or business partners. Treatment assessment. 95% rated treatment as good or excellent. 74% believed captivity positively changed their worldview. 61% expressed interest in learning about democracy. Less than 10% maintained strong Nazi beliefs by 1945. The German prisoners of war who witnessed America's industrial strength did not merely observe history, they were transformed by it. Their captivity became their classroom, their defeat became their awakening, and their imprisonment became their liberation from the ideology that had ruled their lives. In the end, America's greatest triumph was not won on the battlefield, but in its prison camps where the reality of democratic prosperity achieved what armies could not, the transformation of enemy minds. These men had arrived convinced of German superiority and American weakness. They left knowing the truth. American industrial power was not only immense, it was beyond comprehension to those who had grown up under rationing, scarcity, and dictatorship. The trains that carried them into captivity in 1943 had brought soldiers of the Third Reich. The ships that carried them home in 1946 carried future citizens of a democracy. They had seen the future, and they understood that it worked. Their experience stands as proof of a profound truth. The greatest weapon in America's arsenal was not its tanks or its bombers, but the living example of a free society's ability to create abundance. The German prisoners were not defeated by force, they were convinced by evidence. In their transformation lay the beginnings of Europe's post-war renewal and the true collapse of the Nazi dream. They returned to Germany not as broken soldiers, but as witnesses to what free people could build when guided by dignity, opportunity, and cooperation. The economic miracle that lifted West Germany in the 1950s had its earliest foundations in those prison camps, where men learned that prosperity comes not from conquest, but from freedom, not from racial hierarchy, but from human worth, not from control, but from collaboration. The prisoners had come expecting to find a divided, struggling nation. Instead, they found an industrial giant, powerful, organized, and humane. They arrived as captives, but they left as witnesses to the arsenal of democracy at its height. In their awe at America's abundance lay the first seeds of the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, and the democratic rebirth of Germany. Their children would grow up not in tyranny, but in a free and prosperous nation allied with the very country their fathers had once fought. And it all began when 1,850 veterans of Rommel's Africa course stepped off a train in Mexia, Texas, and discovered that everything they had believed was wrong. The story of the German POWs in America is at its heart a story of redemption through understanding. It shows that the greatest victories are not always won through destruction, but through demonstration, not through force but through example, not through hatred but through humanity. These former soldiers, once symbols of totalitarian power, became unwitting messengers of democracy, carrying home lessons that would help rebuild their country and reshape Europe itself. Their journey from loyal warriors of the Reich to citizens of a free Germany remains one of the most remarkable transformations of the 20th century. It was achieved not by the might of weapons, but by the quiet, undeniable proof of what freedom could accomplish. In the end, America's true strength was not just its capacity to build machines of war, but its ability to turn enemies into allies, and to inspire change through the simple power of example. The German prisoners were astonished by America's industrial power, but more importantly, they were changed by it. And within that change lay the foundation for a better, freer world.